Welcome to independent, authentic, raw, unfiltered media. Okay.
Exactly.
So
With all of its ups and downs.
With all of the obstacles. All right, Andrew, thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure.
I'm really grateful because, as you know, I'm just a lay journalist, not a lawyer. So I'm really grateful to you to kind of unpack the hurricane that we seem to be in. And so I wanted to kick off with asking you about Kilmar, Abbgo, Garcia, just because there's so much about it in the news that it's easy for people to get lost. And as far as I'm aware, right now we're in a kind of gridlock, right? Where the judge is her name right? Zinni?
Zinnis.
Instead of saying, okay, government, what are you doing? You've been told to make efforts to get this man back to face due process, and the government's doing nothing. So, or appears to be doing nothing. So, where does that leave us?
Sure. Well, I think there's sort of like there's a way to think about this case that's sort of big picture and easy to understand, and then there's the granularity. And big picture is you have repeated violations of law. This is a man who was removed from this country to El Salvador in violation of an order that said that's the one country you cannot send him to.
Yeah.
The government's admitted that was a mistake. There also is the Supreme Court ruling from several weeks ago saying that all of these people are entitled to due process. And that means a pre-deprivation hearing. That's violation 2. 3 is the decision from the Supreme Court you're referencing, Vicky, which is that the Supreme Court said that the district court was correct that the government has to facilitate his release from prison and ensure that he is given due process, and they have to report to the court about what they're doing. So those are sort of 3 different violations. Since the case went back to the district court, there have been sort of 2 things that have happened in the last 24 hours. First, the judge issued yesterday a scathing order finding willful, bad faith non-compliance with her order. And so the judge had ordered discovery that the plaintiffs had sought because this man is still in jail as we're doing this, is in jail due to his mistake, and the government saying, I'm not doing anything about it, in spite of all of those court rulings. And it's just incredible as a person to think that you wouldn't try to correct it. So the judge issued the scathing order saying you have to comply with discovery. The other thing that happened today is something that we don't know the answer to, which is the government submitted something to the court under seal, and we know that the plaintiffs have responded to that under seal because it shows up in the docket that there have been 2 sealed filings, but obviously we don't know the content. We just know that there's some back and forth, and obviously there's a dispute, or you wouldn't have had the plaintiffs responding to what the government has put into the record to the court.
Well, 2 things, about me, to me, about this case seems sort of fairly sort of difficult to overcome. One is that the government's position, right, is that this isn't in the purview of the courts, that the president is allowed as part of an executive order, right, to make a decision about, someone who's, an unlawful alien or whatever the term is. So, and then there is this other assertion that they make that the courts have fought back on, that he is a gang member, right, of MS-13. And I think it was Judge Wilkinson who wrote rather memorably, perhaps not.
Right.
But that's a big assertion to make. And And I don't know. Do you think it's possible that the filings under seal have anything to do with that?
I don't think so for the following reason. Let's just take the second thing, which is he a member of MS-13? So there are a number of responses. One is in the court proceeding, the government has not taken that position. In other words, in court, they have not done that. Um, let's assume that now their position is we actually do have the evidence of that. That is what is commonly known as irrelevant. If
Right.
that is like my saying to you, Vicky, you know what? I'm going to put on my former Department of Justice hat. Vicky, I am prosecuting a really bad person. They committed economic crime. This is a person who is a corporate executive and they committed a bad crime. So, we don't need a trial. We don't
Mm,
need due process. We don't need a court. Trust me.
mm,
That's just not the way the British system works. That's not the way
yeah.
the American system works. This is what Judge Wilkinson said. Maybe he is, and maybe he
Yeah.
isn't. He's entitled to due process. And the part about what the government can do without judicial oversight. The Supreme Court of the United States has said this is what you cannot do. You cannot disappear people. You cannot take somebody
Yeah.
from this country and unilaterally remove them without any judicial process based on your determination about whether you've got a law that applies and whether that person is in the group to whom the law applies. There's no law to support that proposition. And that is why you are seeing judges of all different sort of political and sort of legal persuasions, very, very conservative jurists and so-called liberal jurists, all agreeing. This is when have you last seen sort of a
Yeah.
9-0 Supreme Court decision on an issue that's this consequential? And so it really is. I think there's a reason this has captured the public attention and why you are seeing such strong language from
Mm.
the courts because this is so beyond the pale.
Well, it's got, I hate to say this, it reminds me of what a very brave Russian journalist once said to me about Vladimir Putin's methods. He was like, what they do is they look up one person. They don't tend to, it's not a roundup of hundreds. What you do to one person sends a very strong signal about what you could do to everybody else.
Although, Vicky, the one thing I would point out is that while it's a different legal regime with respect to Mr. Abrego Garcia, what the government's doing on the Alien Enemies Act, the issue that led to the Supreme Court ruling at
Right.
sort of 1 a.m. on Saturday morning, is the roundup of hundreds of people in a similar context where the court also is saying these people are entitled to due process. And what I think Mr. Abrego Garcia's case, in addition to being a human story and a heartbreaking one, is he puts a face to the concept of due process where
Mm.
people can understand it and see this is why when I go on TV and I talk about it, and I'm talking with you about due process, it's not an abstraction. This is something that I think it's not just an American issue. I think that anybody who's in a rule of law country can understand that everyone's entitled to that and to be heard and to challenge the law and the facts and have their day in court. And if they don't prevail, the court rules against them, so be it. But that's the same thing for the government. And there isn't this sort of unilateral action that, as you said, you see in countries like Russia.
Yeah. Do you know any of the government's lawyers handling this?
I do not. I do not. Um, I I feel very much for the initial lawyer in the Abrego Garcia case, which I think the people who've been following this closely, when he went to court and was candid with the court, he was then removed from the case by the Department of Justice. And the circuit court, the appellate court overseeing it, called the government out on that and said, that lawyer was doing his job because the lawyers you have a dual hat. You can
Mm,
fervently advocate for somebody, but you are an officer of the court. I know in Britain,
mm.
that is certainly
Yeah.
a tradition that you have, which is that you have a duty of candor, of course, to the court, and you can zealously advocate within the rules, not outside of them.
Well, I mean, I know that you've written that if the courts don't prevail with this, we're in a doomsday scenario. And I guess the clock is ticking. I mean, we'll see what's in these. I mean, do you have any thoughts as to what you think might be in these sealed briefs?
The only guess I have, I mean, I guess I'd say it's an educated guess, is that the government had in a case before Judge Boasberg, a somewhat sort of related
Yeah.
case, talked about a doctrine called state secrets. And that is a way of saying, Judge, we're not going to give you information because it's so highly sensitive that we're invoking something called the state secrets doctrine. It would fundamentally undermine the government's ability to protect the nation. The concern about the state secrets doctrine is that it's used by the government just to hide bad conduct, right? It's
Right.
not being used in a true way. But the state secrets doctrine, to be valid, there's a lot of deference to the government, but you have to make a showing to the court about that. So it's conceivable that that's the issue. What is there I'm hoping what is there is the government realizes that as Judge Wilkinson said, if you did something wrong, you have to make it right, and that it's a filing that is about the steps that it's taking to retrieve Mr. Abrego
Yeah.
Garcia. Um, it would be very late in the day, but given that this person is suffering. I mean,
Mm.
it's so hard to contemplate. This person is in jail,
Yeah.
in a foreign country in perpetuity, absent us doing something. And we hear about the Innocence Project taking on cases where someone has actually been convicted, and it turns out they were wrongly convicted. This person has not even had his day in court
Mm.
and is being, to use Judge Wilkinson's language, is stashed. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the language from the judge, stashed in a foreign prison where, just so everyone understands, has never had judicial process at all. It's just been picked up, seized, flown to a foreign country, put in a
Yeah.
hellhole with no recourse, and has not been talking to counsel, and is stuck there.
No, it's an extraordinary situation. And obviously, I guess we're going to see how Trump, who prides himself on being a deal maker, decides to play this, because my sources in Washington around him tell me, for now, that he does not want to have a constitutional crisis at the end of the day, but he has to play this in a way he doesn't look like he's backing down. So it's
You know, one of
tricky.
Yeah, it is. Although, sometimes, you don't win everything. And when the
Right.
Supreme Court says you've lost, you deal with it and you figure out what you're supposed to do. And you think you'd have a modicum of compassion. One of the things I'm concerned about, and again, I don't know for a fact, is the language coming from some of the advisors, coming from Stephen Miller
Mm.
and others, seems to be not even telling the president that the Supreme Court ruled against him. Stephen Miller is talking about how the Supreme Court ruled in our favor, but that's not true.
Right.
And you wonder. in this Trump 2.0, how much the president is being assisted. I mean, it's one thing to be loyal. It's another
Mm.
to be accurately conveying what is going on so that you can make educated decisions about what to do. Here, you would think if you were told, look, this is what the Supreme Court ruled, and also if you have good proof that he is a
Mhm.
gang member in MS-13, you can do exactly what Judge Wilkinson said, which is you can
Exactly.
plot. I mean, the Judge Nicole Wallace has said this all the time when this first started. There is a lawful way to do all of this.
Yeah.
If you have the facts to say, here is why this person is part of a designated terrorist organization, here is the proof. But here's the thing that they're not doing. That requires a judge to have a role, and it requires the person to have a role where they're entitled to challenge the law. Like, does the Alien Enemies Act even apply here? That's a substantial
Mm.
legal issue in the cases before Judge Boasbergen in Texas. And am I in that group? And this
Yeah.
is what led one of the circuit judges in this case to say, do you understand, government, that Nazis after World War II were accorded more rights, more due process than you were providing these people?
Wow. Wow. Well, you know, I'll be very. When do you think those will be unsealed?
Well, it's not clear they will be. I mean, I
Ah.
think that will know something about what effect they have on the case, but depending on what's in it, if it's something that's truly sensitive and
Mm.
secret, the judge may determine that they should remain under seal. If the judge determines that they should be unsealed, even that order could be appealed. So, I don't know that we'll know um, exactly what it is, but I do think we'll know the effect of it.
Right. Okay. So then moving on to the, again, something that is, I think people feel is pretty frightening, and it's sort of is around you to some degree, is the law firms, because I think today, right, Perkins Cohen, Wilmer Hale are two of the law firms that were targeted by the president, and two that have like Jenner and Block, where you worked, are fighting it.
Yes.
They're in court today. And so I want to ask you about that. I mean, the first thing that I wanted to ask you is, when you read the paragraph in the letter, in the order that was sent to Jenner and Block about you, it's I've only ever met you sort of socially. I was like, is this the same guy who's always so charming and thoughtful? Andrew Weissmann's career has been rooted in weaponized government and abuse of power. Including devastating tens of thousands of American families who worked for the now defunct Arthur Andersen LLP, only to have his unlawfully aggressive prosecution overturned by the Supreme Court. The numerous reports of Weissmann's dishonesty, including pursuit of non-existent crimes, bribery to foreign nationals, an overt demand that the federal government pursue a political agenda against me, is a concerning indictment of Jenner's values and priorities. What did you think when you read that?
So, one of the things, I've been asked, like, when I left the government, I ended up doing work on NBC and MSNBC, and I never thought, I was a lawyer. I never thought I would be doing things in a sort of public setting. I have this podcast with Mary McCord. I never thought I'd be doing that. And one of the reasons that I sort of decided to go down that road was during the Mueller investigation, where the president had tweeted about me. And then there were just a lot of attacks that were very concerted and with a very obvious agenda. I really thought I would like to have people, for good or bad, just know me, as opposed to some caricature that can be sort of displayed about me. Because when you're in the government, you can't respond to that that stuff.
Mm.
You have
Yeah.
to just appear in court. And I just thought, you know what? I'd really, if I'm going to be vilified, I'd like it at least be based on the actual facts.
Right.
And so, in that sense, it's been really useful because I think, um, I try to display who I am on TV, and I think in my personal life as well. Obviously, like everybody, I'm not going to say I'm like a perfect person or a perfect prosecutor or a perfect lawyer. I've been a defense lawyer and a prosecutor. My general view is one. Um, I really try, because of the role I have now, which is like your role, is I really don't like being the story because I
Right.
want to. I have decided and part of my career is to be a legal analyst, and so I don't want that taken from me
Yeah.
by being the story. So I've always tried to address the issues in a that like the example of me in a broader context of like I am not the only person in that
Mm.
bucket. I mean, there's many, many, many people who get vilified for just saying things that the president doesn't like or standing up to him. And you mentioned law firms, you see it in universities.
Mm.
Just today, the judge overseeing the Perkins Coie case was the subject of a vociferous and I think just a smear campaign. That's Judge Beryl Howell, a magnificent jurist. That doesn't mean you always agree with the judge or disagree. It's just like these are people who are doing their job. So I'm in very good company, I would say,
Yes.
of people like that. On the specifics of what's being said, I mean, it's pretty laughable. None of that is. None of that is certainly not criminal, but it's just to me, it's one of the things that I have repeatedly said about journalism is that we tend to follow a shiny object and we tend to cover adjectives and adverbs. And which, the president is very good at throwing out. And at times, of course, you do need to cover that because it's so outrageous and outlandish, and you need to sort of talk about the language he's using because that is a
Mhm.
story. But it's very important to peel that back. So, like, if you say there's fraud in the election, this is and the worst fraud that's ever happened, et cetera, is to peel that back and say, and please, tell me what the specific proof is. What are the facts? What is this based on? And I think that is where so much of this, the sort of vituperative, childish nature of this, but which could
Right.
be extraordinarily dangerous, can be unmasked.
Well, I mean, actually, and one of the things I wondered when I read this was if the president realized you no longer actually worked at Jenner and Block. I
Well,
mean, it's
it's clear he did not understand that just from the wording of it.
it
I
reads
mean,
that way.
yeah, the judge in the case that issued that found that this, like all the judges have struck these down, the provisions that were challenged under various provisions of the Constitution. So that means that President can repeatedly has done these violations of the First Amendment and other amendments in the Constitution. Um, but that was the judge pointed that out, which is, I that I don't work there, but as the judge said, it's also irrelevant. Whether I work
Mm.
there or not, it is still unconstitutional.
Right. But in this instance, you know, is it not sadly the fact that even though, right, this has been stayed so far, that it could cost Jenner and Block business because other law firms have capitulated. And I wondered what you felt about that. Obviously we've read about Brad Cart, the head of Paul Weiss, going into this meeting in the Oval Office with Bob Jeffrey, the senior partner of Sullivan and Cromwell, on the phone. Trump's lawyers advising him as to what to do. And um, what do you feel about that? Because obviously, once you divide the law firms on this issue, they're not as strong as if they stand, united, right? Because
Yeah, I mean, I think that collective action in the face of something that's been found repeatedly to be unconstitutional is important, whether we're talking about the law firms or whether we're talking about the attacks on academia.
yeah,
It's a similar thing, and it's useful to make sure we see it together. That these are not isolated
no,
events. And I just did an event at Princeton. We did a live podcast from Princeton, which was a wonderful. It's a wonderful venue. I went there and I felt so timely, and I was so honored to be there, and I'm honored to be an alum because the president of Princeton, Chris Eisgruber, has been really the leader of, and now he's been joined by lots of other people. But the president of Princeton has been very vocal about why this is wrong, why this is an attack on academic freedom. But to your point, why you have to act together, why this has to be a collective. With the law firms, it remains to be seen exactly what happens. I would say that whether it's in academia, whether it's in law firms, I don't think it's a black and white issue in terms of the upsides and downsides, because it is true that there are risks of losing business. It is also the case that that firms that capitulate may lose partners, associates. I can tell you, my law students are very concerned about going to firms that have capitulated and participating in that. But also, clients get to choose where their business goes, and clients may very well choose to support the firms that are resisting and
right.
saying they understand they want a law firm that's going to fight for them, that is independent and understands their ethical obligations to their clients. So again, by the way, I'm not saying that all of the firms that capitulate, where I know lots of the lawyers there and they're excellent
Hmm.
people, but I don't think it's a one way thing. It remains to be seen how that plays out.
Right. And one thing I wanted to ask you about the universities, particularly with what's going on with Harvard. Um, I was struck again by the role of lawyers, that the White House, or is asserting, have played the part in somebody's been now being blamed for sending Harvard a draft of something that hadn't been finished, right? And now everyone's trying to get back in the room. And I mean, was a good reminder to me of whether or not that is true.
Yes.
How, but but how essentially in all negotiations and deals, how important um, lawyers are. Um, I guess I get. I mean, what are your thoughts on the current situation with Harvard?
Um, so first, we started by talking about Abrego Garcia, where there is an admitted mistake. And in the Harvard case, you have this claim, a belated claim of a mistake by the government. One is clearly, has been admitted to be a mistake. In the Harvard situation, I just don't believe that. I mean, I didn't fall off a turnip truck yesterday, I don't think it's just because I'm a cynical New Yorker. The letter was signed by three senior members of the Trump administration when the Harvard university position was like, we're not agreeing to all of this. And their response was measured in the sense that they didn't say we never would agree to anything. It was clear that there'd been some negotiation and they weren't closing off, every avenue. But they're like, we can't do this. What was the administration's view? They didn't say, oh, wait, this was a mistake. They said, okay, now we're taking your funding. Now we're going to
Right.
look at your IRS status. Now we want all of these records about international students. In other words, they kept on doubling down, tripling down, quadrupling down. None of that is consistent with, oh, we made a mistake. To me, it read like, um, almost what should have happened in was we talked about with Abrego Garcia, which is, it's like, just own it. And, look, this is, as I would say, man up. If you realize that you had taken this position and that this is not the road that you want to go down, that you're getting a lot of pushback, for whatever reason, just sit down. But it just reads like you're so weak that you can't even say, we're now going to negotiate, or that the mistake wasn't sending the letter. The mistake was the position that you took. And just to be clear, let's assume that I'm wrong and it actually was a mistake. Although, just so you know, I don't think I am wrong here. What kind of gross incompetence is that? You sent a letter threatening academic freedom of if not the, certainly one of the leading academic institutions in the world. The gross incompetence of that is matched by our discussion with respect to Mr. Abrego Garcia, but in a very different context.
Well, I hate to tell you this, my second book was called The Liar's Ball. It was about the world of New York real estate. Our president features in it. And, in that world, it's all about sue or be sued. And you try one tactic, and if that doesn't work, you try another tactic. And to me, this smells an awful lot of that kind of behavior. What about governing by executive orders? Executive orders reign out of the White House these days. How worried are you about that? Obviously, the good thing about it, even Karl Rove wrote this in the Wall Street Journal, is that executive orders can be undone by executive order, but that's a long way away.
Yeah, so that's true that it doesn't have the permanence of it, but it can have obviously dire consequences for people, for institutions that we've been talking about. When it was done by President Biden or President Obama, Donald Trump was one of the first people to attack executive orders because it didn't go through Congress when you're dealing with congressional powers, and so that didn't have all of the process. What I would say is not only is that true, this issue of that it basically turns our country into not just a unitary executive, but I think what the president wants is just unitary government, meaning without the judiciary and without the legislature. And I think that with these executive orders, I think one thing that is interesting is that the vast, vast majority of what the Trump administration so far has done is to take these unilateral actions through executive order and then that puts the burden on the people affected to have to stop it, to have to go to court, to have to go to the press. It's sort of cheap in the sense of it's not, they're not building a case. They're not creating something. They're not carrying a burden that has to be proved in court. And so in that sense, it's an interesting strategy because it's taking sort of the easiest way to do something. But I think that's also why you're seeing just a remarkable number of court, not just cases, but court injunctions striking this down, and up to and including unanimous decisions by the Supreme Court. One quick note is even the 7-2 decision from Saturday morning, the two, which was Justices Alito and Thomas, ended their dissent by saying, just to be clear, the government has to comply with due process that we said a couple weeks ago. It really was 7-2 on technical issues, but they were still holding on to the 9-0 that there has been a due process violation and that these people are required to be given due process. So that I think that kind of unilateral action is, I think, being met, but in the moment by the courts And I think you're seeing that in a whole variety of cases. Just what you just saw as of yesterday is, Harvard is now suing.
Yes.
And so has taken the action with respect to the proposed activity by in terms of its funding. And so, again, stay tuned as to where the courts respond to what is going on.
Well, and I mean, I was going to ask you about that, because obviously there were many people on the left who were worried, right? This is a Supreme Court with a supermajority of supposed, conservative judges. Three of them were appointed by Donald Trump. And so would the system hold? But the system does appear so far to be holding, right?
I would say the courts
The
appear
court.
to be holding.
Yes.
I would not say that's true with respect to Congress.
Right.
And I would not say that's true with respect to all elements of the executive branch, where the executive branch, I was in the executive branch as the Department of Justice and the FBI are within it. You have taken oath of office, and your oath is not to the president. It is not to the attorney general or the head of the FBI. It's to the public. I still remember when I was FBI general counsel, my client was the public. It was the
Mhm.
director could have views about what he thought should happen, but I worked for Director Mueller, so of
Mhm.
course, he knew this, that he was not my client, and
No,
he didn't think of himself that way.
it's very, very interesting. So, can I ask you, with a straight face, given all your experience at the FBI and at the Justice Department, when Trump said, the Justice Department is weaponized, is he wrong?
Yes. I think that I just don't see any evidence of that with respect to, let's just take the Biden administration. There's some obvious things to look at, which is this is a Department of Justice that prosecuted numerous Democrats, sitting senators. Um, my word, the president's own son, the attorney general, appointed as special counsel and had that go forward. So that's sort of the antithesis of it. I would note that every judge that had to look at the issue of selective prosecution of the case against Donald Trump rejected it. Even Eileen Cannon didn't find that there was selective prosecution, although she never ruled on all of the motions,
Right.
but everyone who addressed the issue did not find it. And that's where facts matter. But when you have the president of the United States ordering investigations into Chris Krebs was, first of all, he was in the Trump administration. His crime was doing his job. I mean, crime is in quotes.
Yeah.
His crime was announcing that he found no evidence of material fraud in the election. And there's never been proof otherwise. And that is somebody who was attacked in an executive order. And you have something that, since the Watergate era, doesn't happen in this country, which is that the White House, although they have the power to, every administration except Donald Trump's understand that the White House should not be involved in saying who gets prosecuted and who doesn't get prosecuted. The White House can be involved, obviously, in policy decisions. Like, I think that drugs should be prosecuted more, or immigration should be a focus. They can make all sorts of priorities. That's absolutely appropriate. But the issue of who gets prosecuted and who doesn't is something that, if you have a transactional president who doesn't think about policy and principle, engages in. But I've served in so many different administrations. I remember during the Enron case, the
Mhm.
president brought up Arthur Anderson.
Yeah.
That was a case that was decided to be brought by Republicans during the Bush era. I
Yeah.
didn't decide that. It was decided by wonderful people. And not for a moment was there political interference in that case? And I wouldn't have ever thought there would be, and because that's not a partisan issue. That is a question of does the rule of law require? You saw that with Attorney General Sessions in the Trump 1.0 term. His sin in the eyes of Donald Trump was that he wasn't taking those kinds of orders. So I really think that it's very easy to think, oh, it's just tit for tat and everybody's weaponizing. But I think if you look at the actual facts, I mean, you don't see, now you have overt public weaponizing. And you also have all sorts of abusive uses of the pardon power in terms of using it for friends and not for foes. Obviously, by the way, that is lawful. It is just abusive.
Right. So I guess my last question is, as someone who studied the law, followed the law all their professional life, is there anything historically that this moment in time compares to? Is there any useful moment in history that we should look at as to how to navigate what we're in?
Sure. So I think there's lots. I mean, I don't think anything's going to be apples to apples. Like, there's not a one-to-one. And so I think internationally, obviously, there are a lot of examples. Lots of people have talked about Hungary, Viktor Orban, as setting out a model, what's happened in Poland, and Poland sort of what it learned from the Viktor Orban model. So internationally, there's substantial problems. I'm not going to go back to Germany, pre-World War II, but I do think when I think about the role of lawyers and how a corrupt administration uses the law to put a face of legitimacy, that is certainly something we saw in the Nazi regime. I'm not in any way equating the consequences of that regime with what's happening now. In our own country, in America, I've had this discussion with my parents when they were both alive and talked about the McCarthy period. And one obvious similarity is this idea of blacklisting and the fear of being blacklisted. So not only the people who are blacklisted, but then the people who obey in advance to not be on that list. Whether it's businesses, whether it's Hollywood, whether it's academic institutions, where the controversy between sort of the Columbia University response versus the Princeton University response, law firms that you mentioned. And so I do think that is a recapitulation. I maybe a great place to end is, one of the defining moments for McCarthy was when Mr. Welch, during one of the hearings, essentially called him out when he had sort of crossed a line and was now denigrating one of the lawyers working for Mr. Welch. And there's this famous moment that you can still sort of read about and see, which is asking the Senator McCarthy, does he have no sense of decency at long last? And I think about that when I think about the Abbgo Garcia case, because I really can't imagine going into any boss at the Department of Justice, Republican or Democratic, and I've served under both, and telling them that we'd screwed something up, there's been a huge mistake, that somebody is in jail as a result of our mistake, and that the first impulse of that adult in the room wouldn't be, if you have any sense of humanity, how fast can we get that person back here to rectify it? And I just think that is such an important thing, in spite of all of these legal niceties, to think about that lack of basic human decency, that you wouldn't have that as the natural response.
You're right. It's a great and sobering way to end. And I would suggest everyone tuning in to go and see, if you're around New York, go and see Good Night and Good Luck George Clooney's play because it's about the McCarthy era. Andrew, wow, my head is spinning. It was, I don't know if it's good or bad, but thank you so much for sharing your time and your wisdom. Much appreciated.
Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, of course. Take care. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.